Hello, Tommy here. Welcome to another installment of Generational Talk. Thank you for joining us. In this episode, which will likely be the first in a series on millennial politics, we will be discussing the stereotype of millennials as a particularly left-wing generation. Hope you enjoy the discussion.
Hey, I'm Paul. I'm from Missouri. I'm a liberal by Missouri standards. But I'm also born in '81. I think there's a lot of '81ers here, and I would say I fall more on the millennial side of that.
Phil, millennial, far left.
Dan, I'm 81, so I guess I'm a cusper by some standards, and I think a millennial by Pew standards. And I'm a grab bag of positions, so if you average it out, I'm probably center.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm definitely a millennial, 87. So I consider myself a leftist.
Hi, my name is Darius. I'm 25 years old, and I would definitely consider myself very liberal by American standards, by first world European standards. I'm probably center left.
So I'm 31, and I'm about in the middle for the Millennial Generation by Pew standards. I by European standards, I would consider myself center left, social democrat. But I'm also by millennial standards from the millennials that I'm around, I would consider myself more a reformist than a revolutionary. So I'll just add that as well.
And I'm a fan of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Let's bring him back.
Yeah.
So in 2018, Pew Research shared that among registered voters, 59% of millennials affiliate with the Democratic Party or lean Democratic compared to half of boomers and Gen Xers. They're at 48% each. In 2019, the Economist YouGov poll had millennials largely in favor of the Green Deal and universal health care. So let's just open up the discussion. What do you guys think about that? Do millennials lean left?
I think millennials lean farther. I think there are more leftist millennials than there are liberal millennials. I'll put it like that. Like, if you notice what millennials are about, it's all about universal health care, Medicare for all. Your traditional liberal stuff tended to be more towards let's protect the lowest and most at-risk parts of the culture and the society. But millennials are like, no, we can't have any cracks. We don't want anybody to slip through the cracks. We want it for everybody.
The media definitely puts us in that box. They say that we're overwhelmingly in favor of Bernie Sanders and a lot of the new what are they called? Democratic socialist policies that he stands behind. What do you think about that, Lauren?
Having worked on a couple of campaigns in my brief stint as a leftist, I have basically grown up in a very fundamentalist culture in which leftists were reviled and put into a category as overwhelmingly loose, morally speaking. I found that a lot of us have kind of brought our fundamentalist values into our leftistness. A lot of us who were raised in the sort of Christian culture where we were sort of posited against liberals and more socially oppressed people groups, vulnerable populations. I would say that we have definitely swung in the direction of being hard edge when it comes to caring about what we care about. I think that we have a pretty rigid and inflexible idealism that is that sort of posits us in a new sort of progressive light. I don't think we have any wiggle room on our stances, which kind of makes us pretty fundamentalist in my view, but for our progressive policies. So yeah, I think we have some baggage, to say the least.
Can I ask 2 questions about that, Lauren?
Yeah.
One is, when you're talking about fundamentalism, are you saying like a fundamentalist impulse in general, as in we bring a fundamentalist kind of paradigm and mechanic to progressivity? That's question number 1. And question number 2 is, would you say that when you're saying we, do you mean broadly, or if you don't mind me asking, including yourself as well?
So I'm saying we broadly, and more recently kind of bringing myself into that as a way to have some self-awareness. And one, to your first point, absolutely. I think that the challenge for us is we have been so polarized in our culture for so long that even in our leftist nature, as the research is trying to show, we still are bringing a lot of the hard edge, just complete lack of flexibility, even to that.
Like the black and white, this is right, this is wrong.
Mhm.
If you're right, you're right, you're wrong, there's nothing in between.
And no
100%.
compromise.
Right.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
some of the hallmarks of fundamentalism are like purity tests and
Yep.
conversionary
Mhm.
language, like, you're woke or you're not. Like a lot of things that sort of define an us or a them. You have original sins, like privilege and that sort of thing. There's a lot of, I mean, having also grown up in a fundamentalist paradigm on the right as well. I've been troubled by seeing the parallels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Easily. It's very apparent. I think that even in our most progressive candidates, the people who we were hanging our hope on, as the research shows, Bernie Sanders, he was likely the one of the most inflexible on his stances. And so it's interesting to see just how uncompromising we can be as a generation, especially in terms of electing a candidate who appears he will potentially compromise. It's alarming to see how resistant we are to that.
Yeah, I mean, so many people, they consider like Biden considering working with Republicans to have been the like Dan was saying, like the original sin. Like that was like the one of the worst things that you could have possibly said. I one thing that I try to keep in mind too, though, is I hate, I never want to generalize too much, because I'm sure there's a lot of millennials that are like, I'm not a leftist at all. I love Trump. I'm super fiscally conservative. I'm super socially conservative.
Or I'm
but
not
also,
affiliated. I'm independent.
or not
I don't want to
affiliated.
label at all.
Yeah.
I think that's
That's a huge portion, I think, too. But I was gonna say too, there's also the loudest voices often times I think take up a lot of the oxygen in the room, and sometimes because of us constantly being confronted by the loudest voices, sometimes we start to take that as that they are representative of how much of the percentage of the population they are, because of the percentage of the speaking that they're doing. And because I just saw a poll come out today or yesterday, I think, by Harvard, and they were showing that the difference between for Democratic or no, not for Democrats, but they asked the poll of who was going to support Biden versus Trump, and it was 60-30. And then they asked who would support Sanders over Trump among younger people, and it was like 61-30. If you see the environment on like social media, it's like all these young people are like, I would never ever vote for Biden. It was Bernie or bust. And then you see some of the poll results, and obviously it's not necessarily the case that it's just 1% more. It could be just different people moving. But I do wonder how representative some of the loudest voices are of the generation.
I mean, on that point, like relative to the total number of votes in a general election, the primary is such a specific segment of people. It's a very small segment. I was saying you're trying to find the numbers. But the way I slice it up, there was a recent Vox interview between Ezra Klein and this guy named Sean McElwee. And he heads this organization called Data for Progress, and they're pretty much like the super progressive data organization. And they make a distinction between institutionalists who are super progressive and liberal, who want to come into the system and build progressive structures, versus people who want to work from the outside. And of course, the answer is you need both. But I think as far as like the loudest voices, they point out that a lot of the people working in, say, Jeff Merkley's office from Oregon, who are super progressive, they pretty much have zero social media presence. And that's not surprising, because the institutionalists like myself who work in, say, the state capitol, we tend to be a lot, I think, more conservative in our disposition, even if our ideology actually pretty much tracks as far as, say, democratic socialism or really anything in that more leftist ideological part of the spectrum. So I think that's something worth making differentiating.
I just want to really quickly clarify. So the poll that I was referring to was of young adults 18 to 29, which wouldn't be all millennials. It would be the younger millennials and a few years covering the Gen Z. And for Biden, it was 60-30 Biden versus Trump. And then for Sanders versus Trump, it was 62-31.
Sometimes we get confused traction on the internet with popularity, with actual popularity. Like, just because something memes well doesn't always mean that it translates to the real world. And there are Biden supporters out there that they're not the ones like really vocal on the internet, right. Whereas Bernie supporters were very vocal about it on the internet.
This brings to mind something that me and my wife were talking about, which is sort of combining two elements that you guys are talking about. One is, people's stated positions and how those come out on the internet. And then the other, talking about institutionalists or otherwise, is how that stuff actually translates into a kind of quote action. And, I've wondered what the effect of social media in particular has had on kind of the human element of activism. And that, is there a way that like the heavy engagement in areas like social media actually ends up being kind of like a leak in the pipe that takes some of the energy out of what might have otherwise converted into more classical action, like, registering for a party in advance of a closed primary. Like there are these little examples of things that, where engagement has been virtualized and therefore diffused a little bit. And I'm curious what you guys maybe think about that, and how millennials, while they may hold more left-leaning positions, that I feel like that there's been a bit of a struggle in realizing those in at least classical terms, in expressing that in a way that the institution sort of takes notice.
Dan, I think I can speak to that. In doing market research for a couple of nonprofits, or being a part of organizations who have done market research, I think there's a class striation there, in which there are like high earning, high achieving millennials versus millennials who have kind of chosen more altruistic paths. And the goal, the hope is that in capturing those high earners, high achievers, that, we as a nonprofit won't pivot our mission to their values, but we will hopefully create a path for them to understand social constructs in a way that creates affinity for these brands. I think that that's kind of the goal. And I do think that a lot of those higher earners are more disconnected from these altruistic missions simply because they are spending probably a lot less time in the type of social platforms that would connect them. I think, for example, in trying to capture millennial children of very wealthy, maybe even liberal donors or people who have been considered activists and who contribute to these causes, their disconnect, their divide is really wide. We have a hard time connecting to them in a way that creates affinity and nurtures it. So the sustainability issues are present across platforms. So even in social media, people on social media are having a hard time sort of trapping this audience and continuing to engage them. The hand-to-hand combat of that is looking the same. It's just, I think the reality is that there are certain personalities, even within millennials, who, even if they believe that they're leftist, whatever they believe about themselves doesn't necessarily translate into like actual dollars or action on their part. So it's really hard to gauge that subset.
I wanted to talk about class, but from the other side of the equation. Like, people are always looking for, where are the millennials in this? Where's the action? Why aren't they showing up to primary, stuff like that? I mean, first off, 10 years ago, showing up to a primary was odd. You were weirdly into politics. So when we pulled the upset and got Obama in, right, it was this bizarre thing. Nobody had ever, thought anybody was going to do that. And the thing is that when you're not taught how to deal with primaries in school, you're not taught, well, you have to register Democrat in this state, and this is how the voting works and all of this. I remember, when it came time to vote for Obama in the primary, like, I had to look up and figure out what I had to do ahead of time to make that happen. When you are a lower class millennial, right, or lower class of any age, and you're working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and you've got all this other stuff going on, and your life is more of a struggle, how can you have the time to research what you're doing to get out there to vote? Like, that's part of the whole struggle. The voting part takes 15 minutes. Figuring out if you're allowed to vote, figuring out where you vote, all of that stuff, and staying aware and relevant through all of that, that's the hard part. Being, if you're 22, 23, and you're trying to figure out all of life, and you add that in, it's not impossible, it's not undoable, but it's more difficult than I think people really want to give it credit for.
Well, this is why I'm talking about the disconnect between the level of ardency and the level of action, because I think that registering to vote, for example, is far less sophisticated a system to figure out than a lot of the line item platforms that a lot of people feel strongly about when it comes to their positions, whether it's class structures or social issues and all this other kind of stuff. And so there is this interesting thing where a lot of energy, I feel like, is going into the internal and expressive processes. But that energy is not, it could be converted into some of these action points. Because, I feel you to a degree, but I also feel like these things are not impenetrable, and we have the availability of access to information for this kind of thing is unprecedented for millennials. And so while they may have, and I'm very sympathetic to, and and experiencing a lot of the classic millennial struggles, like lack of home ownership and student debt and all this other kind of stuff, like it's I feel like that there are interesting forces at work where when it comes time to turn the ardency into like something tangible, that there is this inner decelerator that activates. And maybe it's the sort of a soul level exhaustion that millennials have grown up with, or a cynicism regarding the systems in general. But for me, I'll say for myself that just the sort of clutter of life is it's not sufficient enough to explain that gap to me.
Paul, sorry, Phil, did you
Yeah.
have a response?
Yeah, another aspect of that whole millennials and class, like what we on the far left often deal with, is one of the things that's there is they don't care about theory. They don't care about like, this is how this system works. I care about that. I'm interested in that. They're not. They are looking for what is going to help me, right? So
Which is a very bourgeois position, FYI.
Well, it's not. They're looking at these platforms like they're not sophisticated when it comes to, well, this is how anarcho-syndicalism works, and this is how anarcho-communism works, and this is how state-based communism works. They don't care. What they're really looking for is what ticks my boxes. I need X amount of money to live. I need this, I want this amount of personal freedom. They're not looking for a system to ascribe faith in. They're looking for what's going to put food on my table and will leave me enough to live life afterwards.
Right. In other words, something that's effective.
Right. And so when you look at people who are like, well, I'm not voting for Joe Biden. I know the popular thing to do is to sit there and say that they're Puritans. But in a lot of ways, what you need to be looking at is what isn't in Joe Biden's platform that this person is saying they need.
Labor solidarity. That's what Phil is talking about. And that is the power building that is happening. I think that the millennials who aren't experiencing exhaustion with life are building power, and they are doing it with astonishing efficiency. There was, for the first time in history, a labor union in a political campaign, which was Elizabeth Warren's, and that was an incredible feat of organizing within organizing. So I think what we're seeing also is that there are people who are woke, and then there are people who are out for blood, and that is two very different markets of folks. And I think that the out for blood people are not interested in Biden because he doesn't have any teeth. And I think that is hopefully something that he can address in getting people to rally for him. And I think he's trying, but there were people who were not playing. And just like Phil said, putting food on their tables, getting their health insurance, and forcing power structures to hear them.
Mm-hmm. And just doubling back to youth voting, because I was pulling this up on Wikipedia, I have all these articles on it, but I just wanted to point out that across generations, youth vote is always low. It is especially low in primaries.
Yep.
The interesting thing was sort of Bernie Sanders' theory was that he would be able to turn these people out in a primary. And I think, obviously, post-mortem, that's not the case. Youth vote is typically just low in a primary because it takes, on average, 3 voting cycles to solidify your party affiliation. And so the expectation really for anybody to consistently vote, say below the age of 29, for a political party, unless you're just like a Politico or you work in it like I do, generally speaking, that's a high bar. Just historically speaking, it's always pretty low.
We have, go on.
I just wanted to chime in support of, I think, what Dan was trying to say. There was a Vox article last month, and I felt personally attacked because I knew they were talking about me. It was titled, Are You a Political Hobbyist? If so, you may be the problem. And just to give you guys an idea of what they're talking about, this is by a Tufts professor named Eaton Hirsch. And he said that political hobbyism is a catch-all for all the ways we do politics to serve our own emotional or intellectual needs or wants rather than to do a kind of power-seeking organized behavior. It's arguing about the news, sharing the news, reacting to news, being an at-home pundit about the news, all of those things that involve giving politics your headspace and emotion, but not doing the real work of it. And I think that I'm like, I know that I'm guilty of that. And in some respects, I mean, like I grew up in a political household, so I've experience like working on campaigns, but I think that there's more that I could be doing. But yeah, I'm like, I think that a lot of us, or maybe I'm just projecting and speaking for myself, I think a lot of us are guilty of that to some extent, especially with the rise of social media, like you said, where it gives us all these opportunities to be at-home pundits, and that's kind of like what we're doing right now. And I think that it plays a role in it, and just being like, well, I can just do this on the internet and be an activist on the internet. And I think also cynicism plays a large role. And one of the things that I always like, I just think is such a clear, like, I can't think of the right word,
like
but
a dividing line.
One of the things that I find so interesting is comparing and contrasting the Tea Party with Occupy Wall Street, and how Occupy Wall Street was a young person's movement that it seemed like there was a lot of cynicism about the institutions, and that went just about nowhere. And I think I said this in the last chat, so I won't try to talk about it too much. But then on the other hand, you had the Tea Party that was perfectly willing to get engaged with the institutions and to try to work within the Republican Party. And they now became one of the most dominant political forces in America. And whereas
I would say
totally different.
Yeah, I would say the caveat with that is, of course, what ended up happening was, of course, the Koch brothers. There's been a bunch written on it, like in Dark Money with Jane Mayer, but they ended up really being the organization behind it. And I think that's more of a reason why they took an institutional foothold as opposed to Occupy Wall Street. Yeah,
I mean, I think that there's, on the one hand, people will argue the Tea Party got co-opted. On the other hand, there will people argue that they did. I mean, like, I think I can see it both ways. I'm like, in some ways they were co-opted, and that's kind of what's going to happen if you have to compromise with a major party. But in the other ways, I mean, like, they did get people into office that were very rigid about, like, trying to cut the deficit and things like that did shape our politics. And we had the shutdowns, and so I mean, like, I wouldn't say that the people who were out there didn't get some of what they said that they were wanting.
Do you guys think that there's that same sort of co-opting process happening right now, or is the left, which when people say the left, I typically think of unions and labor groups, women, minority groups. I know I'm missing one in there, but it's like 5 or 6 different groups really pulling for policies that will help them. And a lot of times it just so happens that there is sort of a common space as far as policies, but it's just getting them all under one tent. Do you think you see any sign of that happening in the party now? as opposed to like Tommy was saying, it didn't happen in 2011, but it seems like there's at least an attempt to do it now.
Paul?
Do I see that?
Yes.
I would say the left would be more resistant to being co-opted by like billionaires because
Yeah, not necessarily billionaires, but I guess just back to that question of like bringing them into the institution or into the power structure. Do you see a similarity there, or do you think that that's mostly just going to be rejected?
I mean, right off the top of my head, I would say it'd probably be rejected if it's, but I mean, I see it totally as a grassroots movement. The left as a grassroots movement, and maybe even a collection of grassroots movements, like you were saying, the unions, the minority groups, and all of that together, working either together or in their own interest. Because yeah, whenever you hear left, some people still think of like liberals. They'll think of hippie type people that are just a little bit not exactly the same as the Teamster types.
So we have 3 more minutes for this part of the chat. Phil, I wanted to end on the shareholders. How do you think do you think that the reason why the young left is not as successful as the Tea Party is because the shareholders are not part of the equation?
I think that's exactly it. I don't think that, like, people are talking, is the left willing? Nobody's making a deal. Nobody's made the left an offer. They want the votes, but they don't want to change their platform at all to help us out. You know, Medicare for all is the perfect example. Like, Medicare for all, every other industrialized nation has it. But our politicians aren't interested one iota in making that happen. And that's on them. I'd have no problem voting for Biden if he'd go for Medicare for all.
And what if he doesn't?
Then I'm not voting for it. Because it's that simple. It's that issue, to me, is probably the most important issue in our country today.
When you game that out as a political strategy, is it a sense of you're sending a signal by non-voting that your vote is sort of up for grab by politicians who will enact that? And so you're kind of, in effect, willing to sacrifice 4 years. And I'm not trying to be too catastrophic about this, but you're okay with sacrificing 4 years in order to let that signal kind of resonate its way into what will hopefully be more substantial change later. Is that the strategy?
That's exactly the goal. Is you like, Biden's going to be a disaster. Is he as big a disaster as Trump? No, but he's close. He's a lot closer than I think people give him credit for.
And hold that point. We're going to close out at the same time and then come back in for part 2 of the video.